At age 11, they began singing together. They didn't talk to each other for decades. We now understand why. Art Garfunkel got all the praise while Paul Simon wrote all the songs. Simon did something terrible when he finally lost it. He took Garfunkel's voice off of their comeback record and put it out his own work. But that wasn't the real point where things broke. There was something much more personal going on. Paul Simon first saw Art Garfunkel sing in a fourth-grade talent show at public school 164 in Queens in 1953. He was only 11 years old at the time. They lived just a few blocks away in an area that was mostly Jewish. It wasn't until a sixth-grade play of Alice in Wonderland that they really got to know each other. Paul was the white rabbit. Art looked like a Cheshire cat. Art remembers that he thought Paul was the coolest, funniest, and smartest kid in school. Their shared love of music brought them together right away. They would listen to the radio for hours on end, taking in the new rock and roll sounds. They quickly got together with some friends to start a small street corner singing group, which they called the Pep Tones. They worked on duets and learned how to make their voices sound good together. Soon they were acting together at school events, which was the start of the relationship that would make them famous one day. They chose to record a song called Hey Schoolgirl in 1957 when they were both only 15 years old. They got $25 together and went to Manhattan's Sanders recording studio. They had good luck. A music producer named Sid Prozin heard them and liked what he heard. He talked their parents into letting him sign the boys to Big Records, his own record label. After seeing the cartoon, they came up with the catchy name Tom and Jerry. They were thrilled when a famous DJ played their song on the radio. Hey Schoolgirl made it onto the Billboard lists and sold more than 100,000 copies. Back then, it was a big deal that they got to be on American Bandstand. But that early spark didn't quickly turn into long-term success. Their next songs didn't do well, and people stopped being as excited about them. It was still a taste of what could be. Their relationship wasn't always hard even before they became famous. Years before, in 1958, there was a terrible event that neither of them would forget. Once they were done with high school, both of them chose to go to college in case their singing dreams didn't come true. Paul Simon went to Queens College to study English, and Art Garfunkel first studied design at Columbia University, but later switched to art history. At that time, they were still signed to big records as Tom and Jerry. Simon went by the name Jerry Landis, and Garfunkel went by the name Tom Graff. But Simon did something that made their friendship fall apart. He recorded and put out a solo song under the fake name True Taylor without telling Garfunkel. True or False was a secret song release. When Garfunkel learned about it, he felt lied to numerous times throughout the course of the years. It would come back to them. Simon acknowledged that the recollection continued to be painful even after several decades had passed, particularly when he recalled Garfunkel's proclamation that no matter what happens, I'll always be taller than you. As the years went by, the folk music scene in the early 1960s in the United States provided them with a reason to get back in touch. There was a period of time when polished pop music was being supplanted by folk tunes that were more raw and passionate. They resumed their performances in a low-key manner in 1963, 5 years after they had previously parted ways. On the other hand, they did not use their own names. On the other hand, they performed at smaller venues in Greenwich Village, such as Goethe's Folk City, under the name Kane and Gar. The moment that Tom Wilson, a well-known African-American jazz musician and producer, witnessed them performing was the moment that everything changed. In addition to assisting Bob Dylan in transitioning from folk to rock, Wilson saw that they possessed a unique quality. He had them audition at a recording studio. There, they played the tune The Sound of Silence, which was a haunting composition that Simon had written in his bathtub. In order to achieve the ideal sound, the lights were turned off and the water was kept flowing. In order to start over, they got a recording contract with Columbia Records under their true names. This came at the ideal moment. At the same time that Simon's songwriting was becoming more profound, folk music was simultaneously becoming more poetic and political. On the other hand, their debut official album was not a success. Wednesday morning, 3 o'clock in the morning was released in October 1964 and sold very few copies. Only 3,000 copies were purchased. As the Beatles and other British bands were taking over with electric guitars and rock rhythms, the label had misinterpreted the moment and called it thrilling new sounds in the folk heritage. This was at the same time as the Beatles were taking over. The majority of the songs were not even originals by Simon, and the album had an instantaneous feeling of being out of date. Simon, who was devastated by the failure, relocated to England in order to figure out how to go as a solo artist. When Garfunkel needed to study mathematics, he returned to Columbia University. It appeared to be the conclusion. In London, Simon even made an album under his own name. They both believed that they had moved on with their lives. Following then, an odd occurrence took place. College radio stations in Boston and Florida began playing the original version of The Sound of Silence in the spring of 1965. These stations were operating in the United States. Tom Wilson took note of it. He made the decision to rework the song without consulting the duo first. Additionally, he utilized studio musicians to add electric guitars, bass, and drums to the track that was first made. But there were some bumps in the road. In the session, the players had a difficult time keeping time because the original had problems with the speed. In order to conceal the irregular rhythm, the engineer, Roy Haley, was forced to make use of echo effects. In September, while Simon was performing in Denmark, he discovered that the song that had been remixed was ascending the charts in the United States. Upon finally hearing it, he was filled with utter disbelief. In his opinion, it sounded messy and unpleasant, but the general audience did not share his opinion. Following a total of 14 weeks on the Billboard Top 100, the song finally climbed to the top spot on January 1, 1966. It was like if Simon and Garfunkel had suddenly become famous. And just like that, they were compelled to come back together in order to make a new album called Sounds of Silence, riding the wave of an unexpected hit the entire time. Simon and Garfunkel released their third studio album, titled Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, in the month of October in the year 1966. In their lives, it was a significant turning point. Not only did the album remain on the Billboard charts for close to 3 years, but it also sold more than 3 million copies altogether. They made use of an 8-track recording technology for the very first time, which enabled them to layer their vocals in a clean manner without the sound of Paul Simon's guitar getting in the way. The end result was a sound that was far more polished, but there were also some complications that occurred behind the scenes. A musician by the name of Martin Carthy was the one who taught Simon about an old English folk tradition that served as the inspiration for the song Scarborough Fair, the song Scarborough Fair. It was only Simon and Garfunkel that were given credit for the song, despite the fact that it had been around for centuries. The song Cloudy was another one that was composed in collaboration with Bruce Woodley of the Seekers. Although he was compensated, he was not given a credit on the CDs. In spite of everything that happened, the album was a huge hit. Rolling Stone magazine listed it as one of the greatest albums of all time, and it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame after a number of years had passed. At the Monterey Pop Festival, which took place in June of 1967, Simon and Garfunkel had a performance. It was a significant cultural event, and musicians such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who stole the show all during the performance. In contrast to the other individuals who were destroying guitars and setting them on fire, Simon and Garfunkel stood out in a different way. In the midst of all the commotion and psychedelic music, their soft and reflective sound brought back memories of their folk roots. Their performance demonstrated that they still held a powerful presence in the ever-evolving music world, despite the fact that some people believed that their music was not hip enough for the present moment. In the same year, an unanticipated event occurred that would have a significant impact on both their careers and the film industry as a whole. While shooting on The Graduate, director Mike Nichols had an idea that came to him out of nowhere. The songs of Simon and Garfunkel were the ones he intended to employ rather than a conventional instrumental score. The first time around, Paul Simon gave his consent to compose 3 new songs for the movie. Nevertheless, touring was a hindrance. The editor of the film, on the other hand, simply used songs that were already in existence, such as Scarborough Fair and The Sound of Silence when cutting sequences. They chose to preserve the song because it was such a good fit. The movie and the music were mutually supportive of one another. As a result of its enormous success, the soundtrack even managed to compete with the Beatles on the official charts. The one new song that Simon wrote just for the movie, Mrs. Robinson, ended up being awarded the title of Record of the Year. It was their music that contributed to the movie's emotional heart, and in exchange, the movie provided Simon and Garfunkel with a larger audience that was of a more mature age. The utilization of popular music in films would serve as a source of motivation for a great number of filmmakers in the years to come. However, despite all of the success, visible fissures were beginning to appear. The professional relationship between the two individuals was getting increasingly asymmetrical. In contrast to Art Garfunkel, who was primarily concerned with singing, Paul Simon was responsible for creating all of the songs and making the majority of the artistic decisions. Following then, Simon stated that he had experienced the unbalance. Garfunkel would frequently sit in the control room and provide criticism during recording sessions. Nonetheless, Simon was generally responsible for the most of the laborious tasks. Because of this, feelings of bitterness developed. Once upon a time, Simon claimed that he experienced feelings of envy whenever people enthusiastically shouted for Garfunkel's voice on songs such as Bridge Over Troubled Water. It occurred to him that despite the fact that he had written the song, Garfunkel was the one who received the approval. It was their childhood that caused them to feel such frustration. The words, "You have a good voice, Paul," were spoken to Simon by his mother, as Simon recalled. On the other hand, Arthur possesses a beautiful voice. It was painful. The level of tension increased as time went on. Garfunkel did not compose any of the music, but he had the impression that he was being subordinated to others. Simon, on the other hand, experienced a sense of creative confinement. In the month of January in 1969, Simon and Garfunkel were in the process of preparing to create what would ultimately be their last album. At roughly the same moment, Art Garfunkel made a decision that would forever alter the course of events. It had been announced that he and Paul Simon would be appearing in the film Catch-22, which was directed by Mike Nichols. On the other hand, Simon's part was eliminated from the screenplay unanticipatedly. Beginning on January 13th, production began in Guaymas, Mexico, with only Garfunkel serving as a member of the cast. This resulted in Simon being left behind in New York, lonely and in pain. After some time had passed, director Charles Groton referred to this as the moment when their cooperation started to break down. Taking Simon and Garfunkel and removing one of their roles is not something that can be done, he stated. It's not anything you do at all. It wasn't just about the movie for Simon. He understood it. It was about the impression that he had been abandoned by a person with whom he had been best friends for many years. When they were finally able to communicate, Garfunkel detailed his strategy. He would work on movies for a period of 6 months, and then he would return to make records. Nevertheless, Simon was not content with it. In the documentary titled In Restless Dreams, he expressed his disappointment to Garfunkel by stating, "No, that is not going to happen. There is no way I will do it." When it came to their music, Simon was already doing the most of the work. He was responsible for writing all of the songs, directing the recording sessions, and shaping the sound of the band. For the most part, Garfunkel was a singer who provided input from the control room. To Simon, it appeared as though the collaboration was no longer on an equal footing, and the situation was only made worse by this movie. The 6-week film shoot that Garfunkel took grew into a production that lasted for several months. During the time when he was unable to complete the album Bridge Over Troubled Water, Simon made an effort to continue forward with music. On the other hand, the long-distance partnership was unsuccessful. Songs were those Simon would send. Occasionally, Garfunkel would send back notes. It wasn't the same again. Everything seemed to be off. In order to complete certain sections of the album without Garfunkel, Simon was forced to do so. Garfunkel is only barely audible on a few of the tunes. On the other hand, not at all. The song The Only Living Boy in New York evolved into a kind of farewell message throughout the course of the album. Through the use of their previous stage names as a point of reference, Simon wrote it about Garfunkel. Tom, make sure you get to the airport punctually. I have no doubt that everything will proceed smoothly with your portion. Travel to Mexico by plane. It was through that song that Simon was able to convey how isolated he felt and how far apart the two had become, not only physically but also emotionally. Something occurred during the live performance of the iconic song Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel, and it was something that Paul Simon has always found to be bothersome. When Art Garfunkel sang the soaring emotional part of the song, the crowd would spring to their feet and cheer wildly. This would happen every time the crowd heard him sing it. The clapping was not only thunderous but also filled with admiration. Nonetheless, it was all for Garfunkel. In addition, I composed that tune each and every time. Simon had the same stinging notion. In the documentary titled In Restless Dreams, which was released in 2024, Simon candidly discusses how distressing those particular events were. His decision to give Garfunkel the lead vocal was deliberate, as he was of the opinion that Garfunkel's voice, which is clear and reminiscent of a choir, was ideal for the role. It was still painful. It was not the person who composed the music and words that was celebrated. Rather, it was the voice that people heard. In the course of time, such performances turned into a continual reminder that he was the writer who was working in the background while Garfunkel was the one who was receiving the spotlight. Simon has experienced this kind of frustration before. This has its origins in his younger years. A statement made by his mother in the past has remained ingrained in his memory for the rest of his life. "Paul, you have a good voice, but Arthur has a fine voice," she told him. She said these words to him. That seemingly insignificant sentence turned out to be a severe wound for him. As a result, he had the impression that he was constantly second best. That previous statement was brought up whenever there was appreciation for Garfunkel's voice from either critics or fans. During the late 1960s, while Simon was writing all of their songs, he also witnessed Garfunkel receiving more accolades than he did. This occurred at the same time as Simon was witnessing the rise of their renown. It was no longer possible to tolerate that unbalance. On the other hand, Garfunkel had his own challenges. He acknowledged in an interview that Paul Simon was a significant obstacle for him over a significant portion of his life. Garfunkel experienced feelings of being overshadowed despite his desire to write songs. During the years that they spent working together as a partnership, he stated that he never even attempted to get his songs included since he did not believe they could compete with Simon's. His silence over the matter lasted for several decades, and it wasn't until much later that he began to compose and publish his own material. In the documentary, he poses a question that is difficult to answer. Was it Simon who was the one who never made room for Garfunkel's own goals, or was it he who was the one who ended up breaking up the group? As far as he was concerned, both of them were equally responsible. Over time, Simon came to the realization that their partnership was never on an equal footing. As the one responsible for writing the songs and directing the recording sessions, he was the one. Even down to the drums and the guitar sections, he was the one who made the majority of the judgments regarding how things should sound. During the most of the recording process, Garfunkel remained in the control room with the producer, providing his approval but rarely influencing the song. As the recording of Bridge Over Troubled Water progressed, the situation became ever more dire. Garfunkel went to take a role in the film Catch-22, and the production of the film took significantly longer than anticipated. In the event that Garfunkel was unable to return in time to complete the album, Simon became increasingly frustrated. The delay, the strain in the creative process, and the imbalance between them all piled up to a large amount.